Well, at any rate, it's wonderful to be here again, and thank you for being here with us. We'll follow basically the same procedure as we did before. I'll make some introductory remarks, and then we'll have Mr. Blair continue with the comments and discussion. Okay, let me just briefly sketch the road traveled very briefly, and then summarize the last session, and then make a few comments about today's session. So faith and globalization. Faith is a major force in the world that shapes also, globalization is a major force in the world, and the force also that shapes the world of faiths. And faiths which have abiding attractiveness and abiding power, and that, at least that was the thesis of the course, that are able in significant ways to shape globalization processes. We've floated the proposal that precisely on account of faith's shaping power of globalization processes and other cultural elements that go into shaping of globalization, we can speak of one globalization in many cultural registers. And this mutual influence of faith and globalization can be seen on somewhat smaller scale in the relationship between faith and economic activity, and that was the subject that we have discussed our last session. There we saw that market economies, market conditions influence the world of faith. Uncertainties of contemporary markets in the context of globalization may lead people to faith. That's this one piece that we read by a Chinese scholar analyzing resurgence of Christianity in China. But market economies also shape the way in which communities, faith communities, are structured, so-called democratization of faiths, as well as the way in which the faith is transmitted. Religious competition, religious markets are being talked about. Majority of our time we spent talking about faith's influence on market economy. And there we went straight to the master of masters, Max Weber, and his own account of how certain convictions, religious convictions, in this particular case a very esoteric conviction about predestination, shaped, isn't it esoteric? It is esoteric for many folks. Neil is not quite sure that predestination's, at any rate.
Although he just held up the numbers, I didn't know he, well, he does more than that, Neil.
No, he's got now yes and no, stuff.
Sort of BS, yeah.
Okay, so we've got BS factor from however you want to describe predestination, it has shaped kind of stances to our life described as worldly asceticism that had a very important role to play, according to Weber, in providing a start for economic development, market economies. Connected with that, also we read the text by Barrow, who argued that faith convictions, when they encourage trustworthiness and hard work and so forth, form essential form of capital, spiritual capital for the proper functioning of organizations, economies, and so forth. We also talked about faiths providing normative guidance for economic activities, mainly from the readings that we had before, and that is from Dalai Lama, John Paul II, justice questions, as well as solidarity questions that are being raised. We also talked about faiths and the vision of human flourishing, that is the goal of economic activities. And in particular, there was the very end of John Thornton's comments about unsustainability of the type of economic growth that is evidenced in the West when translated into China, as well as the rest of the world by implication. And then the questions of what kind of conceptions of human life and human flourishing we need so that consumerist impulse would not necessarily continue. And here possible resources of faith in order to address what it means to live one's life well while one's life goes well. These are some of the issues that we have discussed. And as in many of the sessions, so also in the previous sessions, what we managed to do is place things on the table. less than explore issues in detail. And maybe that is the value of this course, because it is such a high helicopter course. Now, today we are switching from globalization processes and faith as traditions and communities of faith, and we are zeroing in on a person of faith that is publicly engaged. There is a personal dimension to all of this. Individual persons are not only influenced by globalization processes, they also do shape those processes. My first exhibit is a person sitting on my on my left. Persons are not only shaped by faith traditions, they also carry those faith traditions and shape them on. And individual persons matter, and matter in very profound ways, not just because we believe in religious traditions, as well as in kind of emerging globalized ethos, in human rights and freedom of conscience and so forth, but also, and maybe importantly, this may be controversial, because I think the creative element that is introduced into the affairs comes generally from an individual person. The novelty, sight of novelty, social novelty, I think, is the person rather than processes, at least I would suggest. Who is a person of faith? Well, we had in mind primarily faiths as faith traditions, therefore in our case here, an individual who is embracing one of the great faith traditions. Now, you can embrace one of the great faith traditions in wide varieties of ways, all the way to, I think, Professor Blair talked about simply identifying with faith as your aspect of your cultural identification, to this morning I heard McCain mentioning him fumbling through his faith or something like that, all the way to trying to be a saint, a kind of a paradigmatic exemplar of what faith means. And I will name some of the features of person of faith, and I hope to name features of the person of faith with features with which great contemporary leaders of communities might all agree. So if you had Dalai Lama here, Benedict XVI, Grand Mufti of Egypt, Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem, I hope that they might agree with some such description of what a person of faith looks like. But of course, it's going to be a matter for discussion. A person of faith holdeth faith expressed in convictions, practices, and rituals, provides them with a comprehensive, though not exhaustive, interpretation of reality. They also embrace as normative an account of self, social relations, and the good defined by faith. And they seek not only to act in accordance with this, but to exhibit this in the structure of their character. And persons of faith are often committed to and feel accountable, more or less, to a greater or lesser degree, to a broader body of co-religionists. In other words, persons of faith generally don't come on their own. They come with a kind of social baggage, so to say, that they carry with them. Now, challenges of the public engagement of a person of faith, and I will just name some of the things that in the course of our readings and in the course of our discussions and sections have emerged. And one of those was connected, and our primary discussion was about the kind of obligations, moral obligations, based on faith convictions that the person might have. And in one of our groups, subgroups, we've come up with 3 C's in terms of the sources of obligations. And that was conscience, which is to say the demands of morality. However, those demands are mediated either by positive teachings of religion, by kind of utilitarian considerations, or some kind of combination of both. Conscience, demands of morality. Constitution, or demands of the legal framework, to put it a little bit in broader terms. And then constituency, demands of the particular group of people whom a person is serving. And then we asked the question, well, given those sources, what is the relative importance of those, right? How do you rank those things? And from our reading and from our discussion, it goes all the way from you have to take care only of your constituency. And that may be kind of a realist position. In Madeleine Albright's reading, it's George Kennan is represented by saying the interests of national society for which the government has to concern itself are basically those of military security, the integrity of political life, as well as and the well-being of its people. And these are beyond moral evaluation beyond good and evil. Some of the religious folks might actually fall into that account, where they would say we distinguish very carefully between the private morality and our public service. Most religious folks would think that that's really kind of betrayal of the main thrust of the religious traditions. Others might say, well, only constitution and constituency. Say a business leader, we discussed that on the basis of advanced reading of Milton Friedman's text, right, where he argues that a business leader of a publicly traded company must act within the legal framework and must increase shareholders' profit, not much more. It's on the shareholders to decide what they'll do with their profit and do beneficial things. And then we talked about possibility of all three: conscience, constitution, and constituency. 3 C's got me confused. Being in play all at the same time. How that's done, we can leave open for discussion. One question that was addressed was, well, how about religious faith? Religious faith being a kind of overarching interpretation of reality, and not just consisting of kind of nuggets of wisdom which I may take or may not take, and its overarching interpretation of reality, which some claim to truthfulness, right? It's not just subjective preference. How does that fit into negotiating between these various obligations? And then we talked about acting in public office on the basis of moral teaching of specific religion. Can one do that? Should one do that? Obviously one can do that, right? But should one do that? And if one should, how it is that one can do that? Advocating a position for religious reasons, for instance, but selling it on generally acceptable grounds. Is that what the stuff of good politics is made, or is some betrayal evidenced by something of that sort? Or acting on informed belief dictated by moral considerations in opposition to the wishes of constituency which has elected you. Is that what you're supposed to be in some instances doing, or is that in some sense a way of wronging the constituency that has elected you? So we also addressed a bit, and one of you in some of the emails swirling around has addressed the question of limits, clearly specifying the limits to which people of faith can bring their convictions to public arena. So these kinds of things is that we have discussed. What we haven't discussed, and what I think is also very important, and what doesn't come up very often in our reading, was the question of character. We talked about moral obligation and bringing moral vision to bear on public affairs, and engagement of a person of faith in a public realm. But we haven't read much or talked much about the character of a person, say the trustworthiness of a person, the courage of a person that's demanded, and what might be the role of faith in shaping not just moral sensibilities, but kind of virtues and abilities of a person to act in a certain way, whatever the moral dictates are. It's one thing to have clear sense of what moral dictates are, but it's the other matter of having the ability to enact that in a situation of crisis. Roughly, that's what we've discussed, and that's the topic before us today, tied into what we've been doing in the previous session. And now I shall pass on the baton to the main kick. No, that's not good.
The main kick now. Well, I am a person of faith, and I'm publicly engaged. So this is a piece of self-psychoanalysis, as much which we're all engaged in here. Let's just go back to the very basis of what we're trying to explore here, to do with faith and globalization. How do we stop faith being a reactionary force? And how do we allow faith to play a progressive and helpful role in ensuring the modern world and globalization work? And what I want to suggest to you today is that actually faith can be a way of making what you identified as these 3 C's, the conscience, constituency, constitution. It can be a way of actually aligning those things properly. But plainly, equally, it is possible that it can be a source of tension between the 3. So are there some principles that we can draw out that should guide us in this area? And as I say, I kind of speak from personal experience as somebody who's been in public life, is in public life, and is somebody of faith. And I'm not sure that my experience necessarily defines the experience of others, but anyway, I will share it with you. And I'd also like to talk a little bit, in fact, about faith and its role, not just in politics, but in people who are publicly engaged in a business sense as well, since I think that's quite an interesting aspect of the crisis that's been going on for these last months. Now, first, faith can undoubtedly be problematic and even reactionary if you're someone who is publicly engaged. It can be problematic for one very obvious reason, which is that if you say you're a person of faith and you're publicly engaged, people tend to think that every single thing you do is as a result of some special relationship you're claiming with God. So, what should the minimum wage be? The intricacies of healthcare reform. Somehow you're someone who's sitting there referring everything up to a higher power. So there can be a misunderstanding, which can be problematic. I mean, more seriously though, politics is about compromise, and there is very often a situation in which you have to at least balance off constituency and conscience. Now, if you're a political leader, you're engaged in working often with countries or regimes you may not like particularly. You may not agree with them particularly. On the other hand, the interests of your country may be very powerfully and directly engaged, and you have to do some balance there. And there will be times, certainly were times for me, in which, even though I didn't particularly like doing business with these particular people, nonetheless I felt I had to, because there were such strong interests in my country engaged, and I felt that I had a responsibility to my country to do what is right by them. There's also another area in which it can be problematic, which is that there can be a direct disagreement between what the organized part of your religious faith says and what you may decide you want to do, actually for reasons of constituency or of conscience. And I found myself in this position, for example, in relation to the issue of abortion, where even though my church had a very clear line about it, I didn't actually agree with it. And you can find, as I think Heft deals with this in terms of the proportionate reason and so on, but you can find across a whole section of policy that there can be a direct conflict between what organized religion says that you should think and what you may actually think or you may decide is necessary in the interests of your constituency. So there's no doubt at all that faith can be problematic, for those reasons. It can also, of course, be reactionary. I mean, I think one's got to own up to this right at the very outset. It is perfectly possible that religious faith leads you to positions that are reactionary, that are regressive and not progressive at all. So, for example, there may be people whose faith would lead them to believe that women are second-class citizens, or that gay people should not be allowed the same rights as other people. There will be a situation also where faith can be aggressive. At the moment, leave aside all the obvious issues to do with Islam, but if you look at what is happening in India at the moment and the tensions between Christians and Hindus, it's in other words, faith for sure can be problematic and reactionary. And there can be a situation, therefore, where if you've got someone who is of faith and who's publicly engaged, it can cause a whole set of problems. It can make the country feel that maybe they're getting something where the person is obedient to an interest other than theirs, or it may actually mean that if they follow certain dictates of religious faith, they end up in positions that are unfair, unjust, reactionary. And if you say that you're a person of faith, people assume that compromise won't happen when compromise often does. Now, I would put against that, though, that faith and a person publicly engaged who is of faith, this can have its positive and progressive aspect, and it can be part of the solution. So, for example, in I think the Johnson and Cox stuff on faith-based diplomacy, they show how actually there are circumstances in which a faith-based diplomacy can give a dimension to diplomacy that ordinary pragmatic diplomacy does not. But I think there are other reasons why faith as part of a person in public life can be positive. I think that political leaders who have strong faith will tend, I don't put it more strongly than that because sometimes they don't, but they will tend to try to take value-based decisions. In other words, there is a limit to compromise and expediency. That's not to say there isn't a trade-off between your constituency and your conscience, and even with your constitution, but nonetheless, I think faith, because it goes, as Miroslav was saying, to the issue of character, faith does, at some point, insist that you draw a line around compromise and expediency. Now, leave aside whether that is right or wrong, but for example, if you take a decision, as I took in several occasions, to engage in military conflict, to go to war, leave aside whether you agree or you disagree with individual decisions, but if you are someone of faith, there isn't a transmission like your faith tells you that this is the right way to decide this issue, but in your assessing of whether you're going to do it or you're not going to do it, the issue of right or wrong is important, and actually, in my view, should outweigh the issue of constituency, or indeed, I would even say of constitution. At least I put that up as a question there. Now, that doesn't mean to say that as I say, the decision may objectively be right or wrong. Leave that to one side for a moment. The point is that there is a dimension important into character in that decision making that is about whether you think something is obedient to your conscience or not. So, actually, to give you a very specific example, in one of the military conflicts I was engaged in, I actually had a discussion with another political leader about whether this was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. And he said, well, I'm not really concerned about that. Actually, I am sure that it's in the interest of my country to do it. And we had this rather curious debate where I was saying, well, actually, if that's the only reason you think it should be done, you shouldn't be doing it. And I think that faith in that sense can be progressive, not, you must understand what I'm saying here, not because the decision is necessarily the right decision, but progressive in the sense that issues to do with values and right or wrong are a part of the decision-making process, right? I think also, and that there is this limit, as I say, to expediency or to compromise. Now, if you take this one step further, and I think that Hansen does this quite well in terms of talking about service, I think faith also gives a sense of service, and I think it also gives a sense of the long term. That, in other words, this is not something that is just for your time, it is for your time and the next time as well. Now, let me try and draw that out one step further in respect of the current business environment. So what I'm really saying to you is that faith can play this problematic and reactionary role, but it also can, at its best, give a sense of strong values to a decision-making process that is, in the end, a beneficial part of that process. Okay. Now, I think if you take the current economic crisis, I think there's an interesting read across here to do with issues that are faith-related issues. And notice, I'm not saying you only get these values through religious faith, but I am saying that religious faith often and at its best does give rise to them. So if you take the current financial crisis, at the heart of it has been a loss of trust and confidence. But more than that, in certain parts of the system, most people I think would now accept there has been a failure to take account of anything more than the very immediate interest in the very short term. Now, I think it was you, Leanne, who asked me, we had an exchange about globalization last time round, and I was kind of thinking about that afterwards, thinking about it principally in the context of realizing that I was going to learn a lot more from you guys than you were ever going to learn from me, but leave that to one side. But I think I'd redefine what I was saying to you, and I think you had a better point than I thought you had when I first heard it. Actually, that's, to be absolutely frank, that's the nearest a politician ever gets to humility. So bank that, bank that one. That's as good as it gets. I actually think you can argue that in economic terms, we are going to have to find a means of re-injecting values and trust into the financial system for it to be coherent and to work going forward. And I was just, because I'm sitting there and still even out of office discussing it with people who are in office about regulatory systems and how you might regulate the capitalist system. And I think very quickly you realize, first, that the danger is that you end up regulating for the last crisis. And secondly, that actually the whole point about situations like this is that they don't, it's not really regulation that makes the difference ultimately. It is about whether the system has sufficient integrity and trust within it. And so if you think about those things that I was saying faith brings to public political life, a sense of service, a sense of the long term, a sense of something more important than you, a sense that there is a limit to expediency, actually these are the things too that would make a global economic order work better for the future as well. So, and as someone said to me earlier, actually also a sense that it's important to do the right thing even when no one's watching, which I think is rather a neat way of putting what faith at its best should give you. So it's not you've taken it out of a sort of utilitarian question about what is the, simply if you don't behave like this, there's going to be a penalty that comes upon you, and you put it into the realms of even if there's no penalty, and even if there's no reward, it's still good to do. Now, the final thing I'd like to say is this, that I think there are 4 reasons that I identify as to why why globalization needs faith in public life. In other words, all the way through, a lot of what we're talking about, and in the sessions between the last time we met, you're analyzing secularization and economic development and religion and so on and so forth. And much of what we're about is trying to work out how we stop religion being a force that ends up being destructive and resulting in conflict and destruction and disaster and so on. And yet, and actually, when the bits that I read actually of Thomas and the quotes he was making on Volz, I think, is it Volz? Anyway, basically they assume that there is a contradiction between faith and globalization. They assume that in the end, the two are bound to come into conflict and therefore start to pull people apart. Now, here are the 4 reasons why I think that's not true, and that actually faith, properly defined, is part of how we make globalization work and what globalization needs. The first reason is that faith, by giving you a broader sense of narrow self-interest or even narrow national self-interest, actually speaks to the condition of the world today. If you take any of the major issues that we face and take 2 that are unrelated to the financial crisis, take climate change, for example, or take poverty in Africa, I would argue that you cannot resolve either of those 2 issues. You cannot resolve the threat to our environment from the changing of the climate unless you are prepared to take a broader view than your own narrow national interest. In other words, if you simply pursue your national interest, it's not going to work. You have to take a broader view, and you have to do that in collaboration with others. And by doing it in collaboration with others, the only basis on which that can work is equitable. So likewise with Africa, for the world to ignore Africa is not in its self-interest to do. As we go forward, if Africa becomes shut off from the progress the rest of the world has made, we will have disaffected, alienated people in large number, and we will have a huge potential source of trouble for the future. Now, there are moral reasons why we should act, but the point is this: faith, which gives us a sense that your interest is more than just about you, but is about something bigger than you, is actually important in a geopolitical sense, given the way the world is today. Because a global community facing global challenges demands global action. That cannot happen unless people are prepared to act with enlightened self-interest, i.e. enlightened in the sense that you take account of the interests of others in defining your own interest. Secondly, I think that faith is part of what globalization needs, because there is one huge and defining priority for any domestic government, for any people in public life today who want to make a success of their country, and that is the development of human capital. And I think faith, again, not the only, but by believing in essential human dignity and the belief that opportunity should be available to everybody and not restricted to a few or not simply allowed to come as it comes, then faith, I think, helps in terms of public policy by saying it has got to be an imperative for our country, and indeed us in conjunction with other countries to help those other countries develop their human capital, provide education for all, make sure that people are getting the opportunities that at present are available to a small number but should be available to a larger number. So, thirdly, I think that faith, because it is about values, I think it's only if you are able to persuade the global community that an action is indeed values-based, by which I really mean just and fair, that you can get support for it. Let me just explain what I mean by that. If we take this issue to do with global terrorism, I am convinced, even though I think it is necessary in certain circumstances to take security action or to take military action, I am convinced that the answer to this lies at the level ultimately of ideas rather than of security action. So in other words, unless you can persuade people that there is a better idea out there to match the ideology that is galvanizing this extremism, then we will not succeed. Now, that idea has got to be rooted in a concept of justice, and justice for all, irrespective of, your own nation, but broader than that. It's one of the reasons why, in another part of the work that I do in the Middle East, I think we will not restore relations between the West and Islam to what they should be unless there is justice for the Palestinian people in a way consistent with Israel's security, but justice for them. So, in my view, what faith, in terms of public engagement, does is it allows us and helps us to make the case for global action based on global values, because it allows us to persuade people of the validity of our ideas by its appeal to essential values to do with justice and equity, fairness, equality, human dignity. And finally, I would say that faith can be a part of making globalization work, because the system works through confidence. The system is essentially fragile precisely because it is interconnected and interdependent, and it depends on confidence. And that's true for politics and it's true for business. And therefore, values-based policy is, in these circumstances, a way of making the system work. Now, what this means, in my view, therefore, is that faith, as defined by a strong set of convictions, beliefs, and values that are over and above yourself, either personally or your narrow national self-interest, that are long-term and intergenerational as well as merely short-term, that are about service of others and for others. Faith can unite the constituency, the constitution, and the conscience, because the conscience in these circumstances actually aids the constituency, since the pursuit of your national interest in a global community has to be pursued in conjunction and in alliance with others. And usually, because that means it is value-based, it is in line with your constitution. Now, all of this does not mean that you can't get to the same position, even you're not a person of religious faith. You can do. And one of the things that's interesting about this whole issue to do with faith and globalization is that you will notice that I speak about faith as giving people a strong sense of values and something bigger than themselves. Now, that is, in my view, virtually, I would say, a universal tenet of faith. So that most faiths, certainly Abrahamic faiths, but I think more broadly than that, to say, love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Right? It's a very, very common position. Now, it's possible to have those positions and not of any religious faith at all. Of course it is. Yeah, and one of the things that we have to explore in this course is, to what extent are we saying faith is the route to making globalization work, or faith is merely a route? Now, my view is that you cannot say that it is the only route. Nonetheless, however, it is a major route, because faith does root a person and a country and a culture in strong values. However, faith only performs that positive and progressive role if it is defined not through exclusionary doctrine, but inclusionary values. In other words, everything that I am saying about faith today and the difference it makes or could make to globalization only applies if we are prepared to look at faith and to engage in faith in public life as based on a set of values that can include others of different faiths and indeed of no faith, rather than as a set of exclusionary doctrines which put you in difference to the other person. And that brings me back to the point really right at the very beginning, which is that religious faith could be a reactionary force or it could be progressive. But if it is values-based and inclusionary, then in fact, in a global community in which countries need to pursue their interests in a more broad way than simply their own narrow view of self-interest, it is and can be a major positive force.